Okay, you got rolling?
Yeah.
Oh, we're ready.
Yeah.
So you already got stuff to edit out. All right, so I should just do my intro.
Why don't you just introduce yourself, and maybe I'll say something.
Okay. All right. My name is Tim Biedron. I am a tattooer, originally from Chicago. I have made my way to Josephy, Oregon from Fort Collins. Lived there for a year and just set up a shop here in Joseph. And was just going to go through some of my art process, the things I do to design tattoos, how they connect to my pen and ink artwork, things like that. I feel like I'm already joking. I just got super nervous. So a little bit of my background. I started tattooing in about 1995 or so after going to art school. Went to art school right outside of high school for 3 years, majoring in illustration and fine art. And then while I was in art school, I was learning tattoo techniques, like kind of an apprenticeship. And then worked at like a walk-in shop where people just came and went all day long, 20 people on a waiting list when I'd show up for work. And so it was a great way to get lots of practice under your belt and all that kind of stuff. And then eventually, because I went to art school, I wanted to incorporate a lot of the artistic side of what I did into my tattooing. So I started at a shop that was a mix of both, where I still had walk-ins and still had opportunity to draw stuff and custom things like that. And that just kind of was right about the time tattooing got really big and more popular and all that kind of stuff. So essentially I went more the custom route and less of the walk-ins, and over those years, developed a whole process for how to do it from start to finish that worked for, whether it was something small, something big, everything in between, and eventually went on to open my own shop in Chicago. And that was pretty much a full custom private studio. Everything was appointment, and everything was hand drawn right from scratch and all that kind of stuff. So I figured I'd walk through some of the process of kind of how it works. So it all basically starts with the client and their concept. Some people have whole binders full of stuff and they want, really specific information. Other people just have a general idea, like I want a bird, go crazy with it, and everything in between. My sweet spot is kind of right in the middle. Like a binder of information is great, but it can be a little restrictive because you're afraid to go outside of this person's boundaries. Someone saying just go nuts, do anything, then there's maybe not enough to go on. So right in the middle is like where I feel like I do my best work, and so everything starts, and I can hold up some of this stuff. So everything starts with mapping out on the person the space they want. If it's something, small that they can do on the forearm, there's not a whole lot of tracing. It's just basically the space they want it. But if it's something that's going to be more of their, covering more of the space, say on an arm. So this is like what I would start with, is just a tracing of the area. So this is the top of a shoulder. I always put an arrow of which way, so this would be a left arm. So I always put an arrow which way is facing forward. That way if there's something that has a face on it, an animal, whatever, a figure, you usually want it facing forward, right? It's just sort of an unwritten rule. And then you mark stuff like the elbow. This is where the top of the forearm comes in. And then I always put these kind of lines here to accentuate where the anatomy is going, like how the flow of the muscles go and all that sort of stuff. And that gives me a good roadmap for laying it out. It's all part of what works for the composition. If you try and fight those compositional lines, it ends up being just looking a little off, looking a little not flowing, and a lot of the stuff I do is really organic and like nature related, so it has a lot of movement to begin with. So you want to take that movement and have it work with the movement of the person's body. Obviously that's, if it's something big and covering the amount of space. Again, if you're talking about a little one-spot tattoo, there's still, you still want those nuances, but so then after I have all that mapped out and I've talked to the person about what they want and where they want it, all part of the consultation, because a lot of times it's stuff that maybe someone hasn't thought about, like if they want to fish, you'd be like, well, do you want it facing up? Do you want it facing down? And they're like, oh, I hadn't thought about that stuff. So I try and ask as many questions as possible to get as much info as I can. And then there's like the research end of it. Look, if it's something, specific animal, you want to make sure you're getting, you know, the features of it right and all that kind of thing. So here's another example. This would be kind of like the next stage. I do everything in colored pencil, which is a little ironic because I only do black and gray tattoos. But from a purely technical standpoint, colored pencils don't smudge as much, so I used to do it with graphite and it just gets all over you and it's a big mess. So I use this cheapo tracing paper. It just comes in these giant rolls. I go through tons and tons of it. It's a little on the yellow side, which is just something I kind of stumbled on by accident, but I kind of like it because when you have a bright art table light and all that's just bouncing right off in your face. If you have something that's a little off-white, it's a little easier on your eyes if you're going to be doing it for hours and hours. And so you can see a little bit of those kind of anatomy lines. This one was like a forearm. And so I try and keep, you know, when it's going to wrap all the way around someone's arm, you want to have a point of interest kind of on all the areas. You know, this would be an elbow, this would come down the front of the forearm. These guys would be on the inside. So this is a blue whale skull. So he said he wanted a blue whale skull with some fish skeletons. So there you go. That's like the amount of information I got. And then I have to look up, you know, references for, I don't know what a blue whale skull looks like. So you have to research all that stuff. So there's a lot. I mean, there's a lot of hours that go into it before you're even setting up a tattoo machine. You know, sometimes I'll just spend 2 hours just looking at references, trying to get poses in my head of, you know, again, which way do I want the front of the skull? Which way do I want the, you know, the fish to go? And how do I want them to all interact? All that stuff. And again, it's like, yeah, I know what a fish skeleton looks like, but not off the top of my head. You gotta pool a whole bunch of resources and stuff. So once I have a drawing about that stage with the colored pencils, and again, the color pencils are nice too, even though I only do black and gray work, is because then I can visually separate areas, and I'll usually just randomly grab a cool color and a warm color just to separate the two visually. Even though it's going to be black and gray, it helps me during the drawing process to make sure I'm putting enough emphasis on the different areas. And then sometimes I'll take a photo of it and just take the saturation down to see what it looks like in black and gray to make sure I've got my contrast where I need it and everything. And then once it's at that stage, like this is a pretty realized drawing, and then I'll take another sheet of the tracing paper and I lay it on top and I trace over all the lines. So let me get a piece of white behind this. I'll trace over all the line work. And so it ends up with just the lines. And so this is what I will end up making the stencil out of. So when you are doing a tattoo, you're following a roadmap. There's actual physical paper. So I'll make a photocopy of the line work, put that into some stencil paper. It runs through this thermofax machine and it transfers all that line work onto this emulsion that then I just stick on the person and peel it. I'm oversimplifying. It's like, it's kind of a pain when it's like wrapping and stuff. It's not like, you know, peels right off, but sometimes you got to cut it into a bunch of pieces to get it to work and everything. But essentially that's what ends up becoming my stencil. And then I'll put these two back together, like with the line work on top of the shading. And then I've got a good roadmap for not only the line work, but also the where I want the shading to go. So I'll kind of stick them back together and you end up with a finished drawing that looks something like that. And then I'll keep that up while I'm tattooing and I can kind of, because when you're a few inches away, sometimes it just looks like a bunch of purple lines and you want to make sure you're in the right spot on your roadmap here and everything. So, so once I have all that stuff done, then it's a little bit of creativity with the shading. I don't feel like they're 100% realized when they're on the paper. You know, I'll allow X amount of room to do shading while I'm tattooing and kind of improvise certain areas that need it and whatnot without, you know, going too far off of this where like a client is going to be uncomfortable where they're like, what part is this going to look like or that. I try and have enough information where there's no guesswork, you know. But sometimes it is. It's hard to get get the information to where someone can kind of like understand that, you know, certain areas in the drawing, like these parts here will be just skin tone, like it looks white on a page, but it won't be any like white pigment or anything like that. So you're playing off of the actual skin tone as your background. So all that stuff would be, you know, that's in red would be black shading, etc. So the process for that really kind of turned into the same exact process I do with like my regular, I say regular, but my non-tattoo art. So when
Question I think is a particularly interesting and unique one here. And how you design a 2D drawing to transfer it onto a 3D person.
Yeah, it's really challenging.
Because that's not something that has to be done in very many other mediums at all.
Right.
What are the tricks to that?
So one of the tricks is when you're thinking about something that is going to be wrapping all the way around, and this is a trap to fall into if you're not paying attention to that exact fact, is that when you look at a drawing, right, if you're just having something in a rectangular frame, you're really not, your composition approach is going to be totally different when this is going to be your ending point and that's going to be your ending point. But when you're tattooing, you have to realize that this part here is going to match up with that part there. So, you know, you really are like curving it all the way around, so those two ends are going to meet, you know, together on the back like that. And so you want to make sure that information works with the stuff on the other side. So it's really kind of an abstract way if you're only used to doing like what you suggested, where, you know, you just have a rectangle and you want the composition to work and everything, but you don't really have to account for what is on one side touching what's on the other side. It'd be like, I remember in art school we had to design a cookie tin, and it was the exact same way. You know, if you just had all this cool composition, but it was dead on this side and dead on that side, when those two sides meet, you're gonna have, you know, 1/8 of your cookie tin is just gonna have nothing going on. So it's really similar, you know, you're wrapping it all the way around. So if I was just gonna draw this, say it's like a regular illustration for, you know, just to hang on a wall or something, I might have like, you know, I'd have waves here and maybe some more waves here on this side. But then as a tattoo, if you wrap those, and those two sets of waves are just going to overlap, and it might not be interesting. So it's very tricky to do that, you know, forearms, legs, anywhere that it's going to, where the two sides are going to meet, you really have to think about it. And you have to think about where on that complete 360 you want interesting things to happen, you know, because yeah, there are, if you are going to have, say,
you only see one side of an arm at a time.
Right, exactly. And I always try and keep in mind, I'll usually break the anatomy down into like these sections, you know, you want something interesting here because that's what the person wearing it is going to be looking at. You want something interesting here because that's what's going to show on the side, you know, and then you have here, this is a whole separate area up top. It doesn't mean you have to fill every single inch of it with all kinds of things, but you want compositionally there to be interesting things throughout it without being too cluttered. So it really is like there's a whole dance involved in like how much is too much and all that kind of stuff. So sometimes I find that like you think, oh, I've got a whole arm, let's just throw a million things in there. But really, if you start simplifying it into its like base areas, you know, you can really start stripping it away and simplifying it. Which usually is kind of what works compositionally. You know, less is more is a pretty good rule of thumb for most stuff. So, so when my shop in Chicago turned 5, we had an anniversary party, and we were trying to think of something to do that would be like, you know, a way to show clients that we appreciate them and everything. So we're like, let's do a poster. And I thought, I've only had a little bit of experience with prints and things like that, and I always thought like, well, if you do a print, the color can be off and all that kind of thing. So I'll just do something just black and white, or just pen and ink. Never really did one before, aside from like, you know, maybe a couple of them in high school and that sort of thing. And I did this, just took it upon myself to do this big, complicated pen and ink drawing for our poster for the shop. And it was the first one I had done, yeah, probably since I was a teenager. And I just loved the process, and it was right when I was transitioning all my tattooing into black and gray, because I did tons of color tattoos for years, and then now I kind of have, well, I say now, but it's like maybe the last 7 years or so, phased out color and just did black and gray. And so it was right about that same time, and then I really fell in love with doing pen and ink, and that's kind of the other side of my artwork now, is doing pen and ink drawings. And the process is really very similar. Obviously not a tracing of anatomy or anything like that, but I start the exact same way. I have I'll do a pencil sketch like this, I'll do the line work on top, and then instead of making a stencil, I take the line work for a pen and ink drawing, and I'll put it a piece of Bristol board, which is what I like to use for pen and ink stuff. It's really smooth, the pens like glide. The only disadvantage is that it's very bright. I was talking about how I like this yellow paper. Bristol board is very white, so when you're doing the pen and ink stuff on Bristol board, you kind of go like a little snowblind after a while. Like I have to take a lot of breaks because you're just staring at that white sheet and the stark black and white, and it can get a little intense. But I'll take the line work sheet and I put it on top, put the Bristol board on top, and Bristol board is just this, you can get it in these pads like this kind of stuff, but it's really, it's like a cardstock kind of paper, and I would just take the Bristol board, put it on top, and then put it on top of a light table, and then just retrace all those lines, and then I'd have this blueprint for my pen and ink drawing, and then I would just start in with the hours and hours and hours of tiny little, you know, the little hatch marks, and it's kind of a crossover between my tattoo style and my, I incorporated a little bit of my pen and ink style. I suppose it probably started first as how I did my tattoos, and then I realized like, well, with pen and ink you can do way more detail. And so my tattoos are pretty detailed, but I found it really freeing to do the pen and ink drawings because there's so much more you can do. You can do so much more detail. You can really get in there and do fine lines, and you can do a lot of that stuff with tattooing as well, but you have to consider how it's going to age. You know, a lot of times if you do all these little details and whatnot, they'll look great for a few years, but I've been tattooing for over 25 years, so I get to see stuff that's 20 years old or whatever, and you know, I don't care who it's on, how well they're taking care of it. I mean, stuff fades, and you have all these tiny little lines next to each other. They're gonna mush together, so it's something to like keep in mind when you're, composing a tattoo. There's a lot more constraints. When it's an ink drawing, it's just kind of like, I can do whatever. I don't have to worry about overworking the skin or anything like that. It's like this really freeing experience when up against like tattooing, and it also has its challenges and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, I found it so relaxing and just like meditative, doing all the only drawback is when you have like a deadline or something like that. The stuff takes a really long time. It'd take me like 3 weeks to do an 11 by 14 or something like that size. Or I did a lot of 8 by 10s as commissions, and that was like at least a couple weeks of working on it pretty intensely. So yeah.
You also made a pretty solid 90-minute drawing, did a quick draw though. So,
yeah.
That was impressively detailed.
Yeah, that was, I was pretty much as nervous doing that as I am doing this right now.
You're doing great.
I'm super nervous, but yeah, I was so nervous doing that because I thought, well, I didn't, so for anyone that doesn't know, there was a 90-minute drawing challenge after the anniversary, the
Willow Valley Festival of Arts.
Yeah, the Willow Valley Festival of Arts. And so 90 minutes you had to do a finished piece of art. Like, I was the only one actually drawing for the drawing challenge. Most people were painting. But that is like 1,000 times faster than I would actually ever do one, I mean, in 90 minutes, I'm barely warming up, I got nothing done in 90 minutes for most drawings that I do. But knowing that I had to finish it, it really changes your approach. But it was kind of nice to have that challenge and like, can I actually complete this? I mean, of course, when I was done, it was like quote unquote done, but I could have spent, a whole lot more time on it. But I have done that in the past though, where I've taken the challenge upon myself to really loosen up and not spend so much time. I remember in doing Inktober. I don't know if you guys have ever heard of that. It's like you do one drawing in ink every day through the month of October. So I tried doing that a couple Octobers, and I would give myself 45 minutes for like a finished drawing. So super loose and using like a brush pen versus a tiny little technical pen. So that's kind kind of free and good way to like loosen up and focus on contrast and that sort of thing. So I think I covered all my, I don't know, I feel like I just rambled like crazy.
I have a couple questions just
Yeah.
as you were talking. Like you said you went to art school. Where'd you go?
That was in Chicago. I went to a place called the American Academy of Art. It was kind of billed or sort of sold as a school for illustrators, basically people that wanted to go into freelance illustration. And this was in like 93. So I went from 93 to 96. And again, right in like 94, I was like probably when I picked up a tattoo machine and was just screwing around, messing up my friends and all that kind of stuff. Don't do that. That's not get an apprenticeship, don't screw up your friends. But yeah, art school, I focused my, first year was all fundamentals. You didn't really have electives at all. It was like, the criteria was the same for everyone, and it was, you know, a full year of life drawing, and then like a general fundamentals class, shading, value study, color theory, all this kind of thing. Second year you could do all your electives. So I did a fine art kind of major. My second year, full year of life drawing, full year of life painting, I guess you might call it. Essentially life drawing, but it was an oil painting class. And then my third year I did all my illustration stuff. So you kind of took everything you learned from the first 2 years, and then you had an illustration teacher that taught all different kinds of techniques. Pen and ink was not one of them, oddly enough. We never did any pen and ink stuff in art school. But you know, they were trying to get you to figure out your direction and what you wanted to do. And at that point, again, the crossover was pretty strong with tattooing. So a lot of my drawings were either nature related, because that's like my one big passion outside the art world, or it was like I'd have some tattoo spin on a lot of my art projects, especially that last year in illustration classes and whatnot. But I found it tremendously useful. I still think about a lot of the things I learned in art school when I'm doing a tattoo or a pen and ink drawing or whatever it is. So definitely valuable. I mean, I was in school with people I think didn't take it super seriously. I was kind of surprised. I thought like, oh, you're going to art school. Like, wouldn't you just buckle down? And you know, and some people were just there because they like didn't know what else to do or that kind of thing. But the people that were focused were who I tried to surround myself with. And yeah, it was a great experience. And then by the time I graduated, I was kind of all through my apprenticeship and all that kind of stuff. So I just was like tattooing. I just basically graduated, and at that time they were offering like a bachelor's program. And I was like, what for? I got a job, and I just kind of never looked back. So yeah, it was great, and I definitely think about all the stuff that I did, you know, in those 3 years.
You can hear it too. You're talking about composition. It sounds actually really complicated the way you're talking about even just fitting a two-dimensional drawing to get your stencil onto the skin. I mean, that sounds pretty technical.
Yeah, I mean, composition is a huge make or break thing. I mean, there's so many factors obviously in like making any piece of art, but like if your composition is off, who cares how well it's rendered? Who cares how good your values are if it just doesn't flow right or feel right? And it's that much harder with a tattoo, because you're thinking in like this corkscrew kind of mentality of everything's got a touch on the other backside and all this kind of stuff, and just a whole other literal dimension to it that can be, you know, and if you don't get it right, it's going to look off on someone's anatomy, or not, you know, not just work with, it'll work against their anatomy instead of with it, which, you know, you want to avoid that. So yeah.
What about things like, you know, your elbow and parts that move? Is there anything different that you do in areas that have a lot of movement?
There is, especially if it's going to be a piece that's, you know, extensive, going to cover the entire arm. I always handle areas that have a joint in them, whether it's a knee, elbow, you know, shoulder. Especially an elbow, I try not to put like super valuable information, and by that I mean like maybe detailed or focal point type stuff, because it gets a lot of wear and tear, and it just bends a lot. So, you know, if someone's like, oh, I'm on a mermaid, I'm not gonna put her face on the elbow, right? Because it's just, you know, it's gonna be all funhouse mirror every time they go to like bend. So that's, you know, that's a good example of like a compositional thing. I would put, you know, the face here where you would see it clearly, have the body come down here, tail here, and then just do like a splash of waves where when it does move, it won't, even if it distorts, which it will, it's not gonna look totally crazy. It'll still look like waves, you know, or I'll use smoky elements and just things like that. Usually some kind of circular spiral treatment to it, you know, for that reason, so it doesn't look weird. Yeah, you don't want to put someone's nose right on, you know, right on there. So
I think it was fascinating when you were describing how you were doing a pen and ink drawing, of how much that was informed by your tattooing process. Because I think most people, if they thought pen and ink drawing, wouldn't structure it like their manufacturing process, for lack of a better word, would be something very different from that. And I think it's fascinating that yours is so informed by the tattooing process.
yeah, I think I adopted it just because it was comfortable and familiar, and previous methods of doing it, not so much with pen and ink, but if I was going to do a watercolor, what I used to use was like cerl paper. It's like kind of graphite paper. So I have like the line drawing, and I put the graph, pretty much how I would make, kind of how I would do a tattoo stencil. So there's still crossover. But I would see a lot of pen and ink artists that would do an entire drawing in pencil and then ink on top of it, and or do the pencil drawing and do the thing with the light table, but they do the whole drawing with the light table, you know. And both of those methods struck me as what's the word? Like, I guess kind of boring, where I'm just regurgitating what I just drew in pencil, you know. Like, I've seen where they'll have like basically an entirely realized pencil drawing and then just are essentially going over and inking it on top. And to me, the inking part where I get to add all the little details and all the tweaks and little, you know, if I'm doing a tree, all the little knot holes and things like that, I like to kind of invent that stuff as I go along on what little instinct I have, I guess, and just have like kind of a skeleton there to guide me. You know, I don't want to have every detail hammered out beforehand, because then I get in this headspace of like, well, I did this piece. Now I'm just doing it in a different medium. Like, that doesn't seem enjoyable to me. I want whatever medium it is to be adding something to the process, not to just be like, oh, well, now I gotta ink it kind of thing. Like, that's not fun, you know? And sometimes I'll just go for broke, and I'll just do like a really quick little doodle of I love doing trees because they're kind of really just stream of consciousness stuff. So like in my sketchbook, like the preliminary for like a tree will be like a little Y shape or something, you know, something like that. And then just spend the rest of the hours just going in and doing all the noodling with the pen, you know, because that's more fun to me, to kind of like just go on instinct. People ask that a lot. Like, I'll do live streams and I'll do these pen and ink, and people always ask like how much planning is involved. And if it's a commission, something I'm selling, you know, ahead of time, lots and lots of planning. And then the opposite end of it is like stuff that's just in my sketchbook just for my own entertainment, is just like very little planning, which often backfires though. You know, the less planning I do, the more spontaneous the drawing is, but the risks are way higher, because there's usually a point where I've just kind of like painted myself into a corner with it because I didn't do a layout and a composition. But the trade-off is like, well, it's not for anyone, it's just for myself. I'm just having fun in my sketchbook. But some of those don't ever see the light of day if they, you know, if they kind of start falling apart. You know, you put hours and hours into it and you're like, yeah, I should have thought about this composition a little more. But it's not the point, I guess, in a sketchbook versus, you know, commissions are, someone's paying you for it, and they're, you know, that I'll do all this kind of stuff with the layouts and all that, and usually send them something ahead of time, like, hey, here's where I'm thinking about heading with this, and it's about as realized as it could be without every single little detail, because that way there's no real backpedaling with pen and ink. As kind of with tattooing, that's another like crossover, is like it's a very committal form. So in order to like make changes, there's a point where it's like, there's a point of no return for sure, where you're just like, okay, if you wanted a bright sky and I already made it a night sky, I can't do anything but like start over. So that's another similarity with tattooing, is like, the more homework you do, the less you're like, whoops. You don't want any whoopses when it comes to that stuff, so yeah.
What pens do you use when you do your pen and ink drawing, sketching?
I've got I brought my little thing here. I've got 3 that I like a lot. 2 are super cheapo ones that most people have heard of, like microns. They're just these little tan ones. These are kind of like the industry standard. I almost never, they all are by like diameter. So this is a .003, which is the smallest you can get, and that, I forget what actual diameter that translates to. The biggest I'll usually go is like a 1. So the whole
question was how many different pens you use to start and then do all the intricate.
Yeah, so it's like usually as far as the sizes go, maybe 2 or 3 sizes. You know, maybe I'll use a 1 for if I'm gonna have an outline of a border on something, and then but 90% of it or more I'll do with a .03. And then ones I really like are these. This is like an aluminum body one, and you can take the tip off. So when the tip wears out, I can just replace it, and I'll just buy boxes and boxes of these tips. You know, they come in little 2-packs. And then also, this comes out, you can change the ink cartridge. So these are nice because you're not throwing away a whole pen. Because essentially what I do, though, because I do so many little details, is the tip will wear out way before it runs out of ink. So something like this, once the tip is gone, it's just done, you know, and you throw out the whole thing. But along those lines, a lot of people will ask me like, oh, how come some of it looks like pencil, or how do you get them so thin? It's the tip wearing out. So I'll just do so many marks, and this was just something I kind of stumbled on by accident. I'll do so many little marks, and as I'm doing them, I'm realizing that like the mark is getting finer and finer because it's physical. I don't know if it's just like felt or some kind of plastic or something like that, but they just wear down, you know, and eventually you just can't use them. But I use them till they are like literally not making any marks at all, where most people would just be like, oh, it's super thin now and just get rid of it. That's the time I use them for like really fluffy background stuff or like really fine lines. Like there's parts of a drawing that I have to have a worn out pen. If I was to start it with a brand new pen, it would like not work. It would feel like a baseball bat, you know? So like, I mean, they can't see at home, but like the Meadowlark one there, like those clouds and stuff, I would only start those with a worn out pen. You know, I couldn't, if I just cracked open a brand new one and started it, it would be way too dark, it would be way too concentrated, the lines would be way too thick. So sometimes I'll even like, because I have these whole bags of them, you know, and sometimes I'll just mark the ends of them, like when they hit that sweet spot where I'm like, oh, this is making really nice fine lines, but it's not quite worn out where it's not usable. I'll like put a little mark on the end of it so I know like, oh, if I want to do clouds or some background stuff, I'll grab that one, you know. So yeah, that's what's really nice about the multi-liner one that I use, is being able to replace that tip, because you know, on a 11 by 14 drawing, I'll go through like 10 tips. I'll just wear them out till they like literally are not making a line anymore. Yeah, people always ask that because a lot of people just think it looks like graphite, you know, when I do like backgroundy stuff especially. And I'm like, no, it's all pen. It's just worn out, you know, which is, I again, just stumbled on by accident, you know, was probably doing a drawing where I only had one, didn't have a backup. I'm like, oh man, this is really wearing out. And then I'm like, oh, I'll use that for something lighter. And it just kind of turned into like a legitimate technique now, you know, where I actually pay attention to which ones are, you know, I'm using. That's the other thing that's nice. This is like a really kind of geeky thing, but I bought 3 of these. So they're aluminum, so when I'm drawing and I am going back and forth, and say I'm using one for hours and hours in a corner, and then I like take a break or something, I'll come back and they just get lost in the pile. I'll pick up the one that's like still warm because they're aluminum. So I'm like, which one was I using? I'm like, no, that one's ice cold. And if it hasn't been too long, I'll be like, oh, this one's warm. So like that's the one I was using. Because you know, if you just like look at it, you can't tell sometimes. You know, like you can tell when it's brand new or when it's sort of worn. But any of like the nuances in between, you kind of can't tell just by looking. So yeah, those are all like really the minutia stuff that's going on in my head when I'm drawing, you know, just like little tricks I've learned, because I've run into that. Like I'll go grab a glass of water and come back, I'm like, oh man, because they're all identical, you know, like, oh, which one was I using? I'm like, grab one, oh yeah, that one's still warm. So But I don't know what else I was just gonna talk about was, you know, this is a little less about like the techniques and things like that, but one of the things I was excited about with opening the shop here in Joseph was basically like getting to know everybody. That's another huge part of tattooing that isn't so much a crossover into like fine art, like, because I did commissions all through COVID, and you just talk to people over email and that's it, and then you ship a drawing to them. But like that's one thing I think I missed the most about not tattooing during COVID was just that interaction. I mean, you just really connect with people and get to know them, and even if it's a small tattoo, you're still having like a meaningful experience, and that was such a huge part of it for me that I really missed just doing commissions, because there was no, you know, I think maybe one or two of the people lived in Colorado, so they came over to pick it up, but aside from that, it was just like, yeah, I want a raven drawing, okay, and I do a raven drawing and then send them a raven drawing, you know, like maybe you have a little email banter, but that was about it. But like tattooing, I mean, you're just right in the mix with them, and you learn a lot about people. I've had clients that I've been tattooing for almost 20 years, you know, that just always finding something new. It's almost like a ritual to them. It becomes like a therapeutic experience and all that kind of stuff. Like, oh man, I'm just having a bad week. I just want to go get something little just to do it, you know, just to have like a little break from reality or whatever you want to call it. And yeah, I think that's a really special part of tattooing, and something that I really am looking forward to, like that evolving as I have the shop more and more years, is just meeting more people and like just being part of, like I wouldn't want to open the shop and just be like a hermit that, you know, never leaves the shop and doesn't talk to anyone, you know, like to me that's like kind of the special thing about this location and everything. It's just like feeling like it's kind of part of something else, you know, not just like, oh, this is just my thing and whatever. I like you know, getting involved and doing stuff like this, and you know, so that's been nice to get back to that with tattooing for sure. You know, I think it's really important.
I think we're lucky to have you.
Thanks.
Really know what you're doing and care about people. Do you have any advice for maybe somebody thinking about getting a tattoo? Or are there any
Think about getting one themselves?
like how to pick out a design, or what's something that
Well, like I said, my sweet spot with tattooing is less about someone. I'm fine with someone picking out a design and here I want this. Like that's fine. That's a big part of tattooing. But when I'm like most in my zone, or whatever you want to call it, is when someone has an idea and they just want my take on it. I like when they start with a root idea, because I don't want to pick someone's concept for them. But if they're having trouble pinning it down as to like how they want it to look, how they want it positioned, I love like brainstorming with them with all that stuff. And I think it's just think about, you know, what's important to you in it, you know, like how much space you want to take up. Do you want, you know, again, like I just throw out examples, like if they want a fish, I'm happy to help them figure out like, oh, do you want it facing down, facing up, like just stuff sometimes people don't think about. But I am most happy when people are like, yeah, I want a fish, maybe it's a koi fish, and that's about as specific as it gets. And then from there, they just let me do my thing. And a lot of times I'll think of things maybe they didn't think about to add, like, oh, let's add some waves. Oh, I hadn't thought about adding waves. Yeah, that sounds cool. You know, and you just do this back and forth and arrive at something that, you know, hopefully is cooler than what they kind of had in their head. You know, I hear that a lot, which is to me a really strong compliment. You know, when you show someone a drawing and they're like, oh man, that's way cooler than I was picturing in my head. Like that feels so good, you know, because then you know they're confident in getting it. You've done your job. You've made them happy. Ultimately, as long as they're happy, right? That's what matters. And so making people happy with all that, you know, getting everything they want in there and some little surprises and things like that they maybe didn't think about but think look cool. So yeah, it's just basically put some thought into it. I'm happy to help walk anyone through the process if they're struggling to think of how to make an idea into a tattoo. Like that's all what I like doing. So yeah, it's you know, it's really fulfilling, I think, to get on that same page with someone and give them something that they're like really stoked on.
So engage with your tattoo artist, don't be
Yeah,
afraid to ask.
yeah, exactly.
Okay,
Yeah, for sure. And if they're not willing to, then I don't know.
That's my
Don't get tattooed by them. Because they should be. I mean, it's, you know, it's going on them. Like, what do I care if it's up to them if they like it or not. Yeah, I try never to be pushy about stuff like that. I want people to be comfortable and getting what they want, so, yeah. So yeah, I think I covered all the stuff on my little list.
I had one question, which is why did you switch away from color work?
Oh yeah, I get asked that a lot too, especially people that have like known me through the years of tattooing. Yeah, in a single word, it was just stress. It was stressing me out, and for whatever reason, I just felt this shift happening in like, I don't know if you'd call it just confidence mixed with like just technical difficulties with things, like that sort of thing. I wanted tattooing to stay something I enjoyed doing, and I felt like, especially bigger color tattoos, I felt like it was harder and harder to have any degree of like sort of fun or enjoyment with it. It was just getting really stressful, because you take all those things I was talking about with composition, all that, and then you throw like, well, what colors are going to go into it? And sometimes sometimes it's not that complicated. Like, oh, on a red rose, like, okay, well, then whatever, squirt out a bunch of red and then color in red. But like most of the time, it's more involved than that, and it just got to the point where I felt like I was increasingly less confident with my color decisions. And coupling that with like just really enjoying doing black and gray. Like when I was a little kid and I even decided to do art at all, like just from just a natural thing that I was gravitating towards, it was always just like a number 2 pencil on like white paper. Like 90% of what I did, even from like way back when, was always just like gray, black and gray stuff. And so yeah, when I felt that sort of shift in color, it was like all these kind of simultaneous things. Like I'm not feeling really confident. It's really stressing me out. I really prefer doing black and gray. And so I kind of just took a leap and was just like, I'm just gonna start phasing it out. And I did, and it worked out fine. I mean, I think the industry also caught up in that regard, where there were so many artists that specialize in one thing that it became less important to know how to do every type of tattooing. Like you want to be like well versed in everything, but you know, when I started in the 90s, like you kind of had to be a jack of all trades. Now it's way more specialized. You can just do your niche, you know, and the people will hopefully respond to it and come to you. Yeah, it's like people would ask, oh, what did all your color clients do? I'm like, I don't know. I just got black and gray clients. I didn't like lose color clients, you know. So.
Have you always liked nature, even doing color and stuff? So you never did like photorealism or any other medium for tattooing?
No, it was usually, I would always describe what I did as like illustrative, you know. Yeah, it's like kind of a mix where I want to honor whatever it is I'm drawing. Say it's an eagle, like I know what eagles look like. I'm a big bird watcher. It was really interesting to see how my stuff changed after like becoming a bird watcher, because birds are like super popular tattoo idea. And I'll look back at stuff I drew before bird watching, I'm like, man, that was way off, you know, and like now I like, because that's all bird watching is, like making sure you know what's what so you can make an ID. So yeah, I don't do like a photorealistic approach to it, because I like to put part of what I do into it rather than just reproducing a photo. But I also try and find a balance where it's not so wacky that it doesn't look like the thing it's supposed to look like. You know, it's like I think it's like a nice balance, you know. Yeah, photorealism is like, it's cool and everything, but like I just don't feel like I'm putting any like heart into stuff like that. So I really kind of shy away from, you know, just reproducing photos.
Finding your style.
Yeah. Yeah, I'd rather like, as far as photography gets involved in what I do, it's a lot of referencing, you know, like doing Google image searches. If I'm gonna do an elk, I'll look at 20 pictures of elk and try and find a cool angle. But even when I do, I try and take like the best parts of different photos, not tracing them in any way, but just, you know, where it's like, yeah, it looks like what it's supposed to look like, the anatomy's right, but I've drawn it, you know, that kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool.
No, yeah.
Like maybe like the last minute, I just like started to relax a little bit.
We're gonna do it all over now that you're
Yeah,
relaxed.
right, yeah. It's like, oh shoot, the camera wasn't on.
The lens was on.
Right, yeah. Forgot the lens cap. Yeah.
Do a golf clap.
The golf clap. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah, that was nerve wracking.
Thank you.
Awesome.
That was
Great,
excellent.
It's, I thought it would be more fluid than that. It felt really herky-jerky to me.
No, you were
That was
great.
super fluid, dude.
Was
One of the
it?
best ones I've seen,
Yeah.
yeah.
It really was. I
That
think
way.
that was one of our better artist talks.
It
All
was.
right, well, I won't
Yeah.
sweat it then if I don't have to, but
In
man.
fact, as we were doing it, I'm thinking, okay, we need to like put a compilation of our best ones together. And I think yours is.
Well, that makes me feel better, because I
Yeah.
thought I was just like, kind of sounding like a rambling.
There's just so
Idiot.
much to talk about.
Yeah.
Yeah, it sounds like you really know. Well, you've been doing it for 25 years plus art school.
Yeah,
Yeah, you do know.
yeah, yeah. Well, as long as you guys think it came out all right.
Yeah,
I
no, I'm
I
super.
felt a little unnatural.
Super happy. No, you were good.